Hello and welcome back to this Downful Idealistic Crusade. This is a book review of the excellent The Searchers, The Making of an American Legend, a book by Glenn Frankel, and one of his books focusing on a particular film, such as his books on High Noon and Midnight Cowboy. This traces essentially the real-life historical facts and events and various people who inspired Alan LeMay to write his novel, The Searchers, and then giving detail about the writer and development and then eventual publication of the book, The Searchers, before diving into an entire history of the production and legacy of the iconic film itself. So this is essentially a complete deep dive into the world of not only The Searchers in both iconic film and great novel, but all of the various figures and elements of history that inspired these works, and also telling you the real story of what happened to, of course, Cynthia Parker, whose story became legendary in Texas and became so ingrained in legend that it's hard to actually separate the fact from fiction, which of course is a key Ford theme in terms of John Ford's work, with that being most represented in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance and the famous lines about when choosing between the fact and legend, print the legend. So this is a nice book-length exploration into not just the legacy of The Searchers in terms of being a towering work as a film, but also digging into the novel and how that differs from the film. But really, the majority of the book focuses on the real-life story of Cynthia Parker, who was captured in a raid and then, of course, was sought after by relatives on a multi-year quest that went on and off, as we see in, of course, the novel and the film that were inspired by this story. But the actual historical events played out much differently and are not as clear-cut or wonderfully dramatized as what we see in the film. In fact, the actual history of this story is not what is often repeated in legend, and is actually quite sad, seeing as many people's lives were torn apart due to the inability of various factions to be able to completely understand one another. So in 1836, Cynthia Parker was one of a number of people captured in a raid, and she was then raised by Comanches, and so essentially lived as a Comanche and grew up in that environment. Then essentially almost an entire lifetime later, about 24 years later, she was essentially recaptured and brought back home and given a complete dose of culture shock, and in terms of being practically forced to reassimilate into a society that she did not recognize. And it's unfortunately a very tragic story. That's, of course, not what you see in the film or the novel, as they were drawing on some of the basic ideas and concepts and other stories, and of course all of the various legends that were told and retold about not just the story of Cynthia Ann's capture and then her being supposedly restored to her purportedly rightful family, not even getting into the fact that she was taken from her actual family and children by that point, but it's also getting into the actual story of the search for Cynthia Ann by various individuals who basically start to make up what we see in the Ethan Edwards character. So in digging into the history and retelling it, trying to distance the actual historical events from legend, Frankel paints a very good picture to allow the reader to see how this stuff started to develop into legend, and you can start to pick out what elements you recognize from the iconic film that we've all seen time and time again. So even if you've only seen the film and you didn't have a whole lot of background into the actual history that inspired the story and the legends that the story drew from, you'll be able to recognize all the parallels that start to come out. And you get swept up into the historical retelling because it's extraordinarily well laid out and well told and goes chronologically. So the first section of this book deals with the Cynthia Ann Parker story, essentially her tragic life story of her capture, then the pursuit to try and find her if she's even still alive, and then eventually when she is recaptured and returned to her biological family, and how essentially that unfortunately dooms her all over again because she had completely assimilated into another culture and was essentially torn away from her entire family. Then the second act of this book is actually talking about her son, Quanah Parker, who became a leader of his people and was essentially a bridge between the two worlds of Native Americans, and also having enough of a sort of cultured standing and enough education to move in and among other circles and be a representative and almost a sort of, in a lot of ways, almost a sort of ambassador for the Comanches and eventually other tribes as well, with various government forces and town forces. He was essentially a noted public figure, and he was a fascinating character who I knew at least some of beforehand. But Frankel goes into extraordinary detail about his life and times and his attempts to be that perfect sort of bridge between two worlds and be an ambassador to essentially assure at least as much of a measure of peace and understanding as possible. But also, he was quite a character himself. This section is so detailed and so fascinating that, just like the first section, it's a movie in and of itself. And of course, all of this is real. So again, you can see certain parallels to certain elements of the various legends and stories, and then of course the Searchers in novel and film form, even in this section. And it's fascinating to see how Quanah reacted to what had happened to his mother and losing her, and then finding out what had happened to her, and then how that seems to very obviously have encouraged him to try and be that bridge between two worlds. So most of the book is dealing with the actual historical record and the people involved in the actual events. So if you're coming to this book looking for a great deal about the actual production of the film, that is only saved to the end, and that's also not really the book's focus. The book is very much trying to give the reader a complete, not just a crash course, but an immersion in the world of, well, really in the environments that generated these events that then were transformed into legend and told and retold and retold and retold, and trying to separate the fact from the legend and allow the reader to examine and understand both and see how they parallel, see where they, of course, diverge wildly, and learn about the real people who suffered through these events. Then the next section is talking about author Alan LeMay with a great deal of nice biographical info. And this is essentially building up to when LeMay would actually sit down and write The Searchers as a novel, after being inspired by, of course, the legend of Cynthia Parker's story, and then taking elements of other stories and legends about captives in Texas history and other tales that circulated around the Southwest. And essentially what he did with the novel is, in this storyline, take these events that actually occurred and, of course, all the legends that were sort of expounding upon them, and focus them by heightening the drama around the actual long-running, multi-year search for Cynthia Ann Parker. And that's where the novel came from. So it's really nice that we get this entire section then about not just the book itself, but the actual gestation of it, and where author Alan LeMay was working from, where his sort of head was at in terms of his career at that time. He had been trying to make it as a screenwriter, and then had also been writing on and off. And his literary career was basically taking off much better than his screenwriting career. So it was very much sort of a foregone conclusion that if the book was successful, that it would likely be optioned for a film, which of course it was for the iconic film version. And then we transition into the final act of the book, which is talking about first John Ford and then John Wayne, giving the reader enough information about their careers, their methodologies, the themes they would return to time and time again, especially in their collaborations together. Then we have the whole section on the production of The Searchers, which is essentially similar information to what you would find in other biographies on Ford and Wayne, or books that get into the production of the Searchers. But here it's nice to have all that information in one place, and because you've gone on this journey to get to the production, and you've now learned the entire historical stories about the real individuals, and then you've seen how the legends have developed around them, and then how all of this came together and inspired Alan LeMay to write the novel, and then how that was transformed into the film. And there are a number of notable differences between novel and film that the book does examine and make really nice comparisons. This builds to the nice conclusion section, which is then dealing with the legacy of the Searchers in all of its forms, and reflecting on the entire story of not just the fiction works, but what led up to that, and then of course getting to the actual historical fact and the real people who suffered through these events, and how when you look at all of this stuff and you completely just immerse yourself in the environments that produced all of these legends and then fictional works after the historical events, it really enhances your appreciation of all of the themes of the Searchers even more, whether you're looking at the film or the novel. And I think it adds an incredible note of a sort of tragic poetry in a way, because after finishing this book, you now know the actual stories of not just Cynthia Ann Parker, but her entire family in two different cultures that were affected greatly by one singular event that was also something that ideally could have been avoided had the conditions not been laid out exactly the same way. And you get enough historical background about all of the various individuals involved that you can see how, unfortunately, the deck was stacked against most of these individuals in so many different ways. And things were not as cut and dry or as black and white as what we see in the novel and the film version, where it is very much a singular event that then sparks Ethan Edwards to go on the multi-year hunt to try and find the last remaining survivor of the raid that starts the story. But there is something to be said about how Alan LeMay and then eventually the film adaptation do heighten certain aspects of the legends that surrounded the Cynthia Ann Parker story, and manage to do this while not ever disrespecting the actual events or changing things. All of the dramatic tension that is added and generated is merely focusing and highlighting certain aspects of the real events and the legends that grew out of them, and the telling and the retelling, to create a story that's not just about one particular historical event, but is of course thematically about all sort of legends that grew around capture stories in the West. So Frankel's book is perfectly titled The Making of an American Legend. That's not just a sort of subtitle that somebody came up with. That's the best way to describe this, a making of an American legend. It is a legend that developed out of real events and was told and retold, and then grew into a really well-written novel that grew into an iconic film. And you get to now trace this journey through this book, and it's definitely a book you get sucked into, and you are just immersed into this world. It is beautifully constructed. Every section flows into one another perfectly. If you're coming to this as I was, as a film fanatic who loves John Ford and loves The Searchers, you're probably at first going to be thinking, well, why is there not so much about the film? But that, again, is not really what this book is about. This book is about tracing the entire story from the actual historical events through to the legends and how the story grew and changed over the telling and retelling, and then transitioning into the novel, then to the film, then to the legacy and aftermath of the film. So again, it's a book that's more about the actual development of what became a legend as opposed to just talking about the iconic film. But you still get all of the production information in the section on the film, which is perfectly laid out as the story is told essentially in chronological order. So you get this nice sense of a progressive flow moving through and actually feeling the development of the legend even further. I think it's an absolutely outstanding book in terms of really running a lot of this material to ground and tying everything together to see how it is a multi-generational story that then transitioned out of history and, of course, the legends that became sort of cemented in stone and, to again reference Liberty Valance, was printed time and time again. The book itself is a really nice tome. It's got this beautiful cover artwork with lovely images of the West in black and white, and then, of course, referencing the fact versus the legend by having two different figures representing each on the cover and sort of reflected here in the corners, and also nicely printed in black and white. I just really love the simplicity and the effectiveness of this design, and it carries over onto the spine rather nicely. And then we continue the aesthetic with the back blurb and the critical praise. The book itself runs about 400 pages. Of course, the last 75 to 100 pages is all of the notes and sources and works cited and things. But there's also a great deal of visual information included, from especially maps of the territory, but there's also a lot of great images mixed in of the landscapes, historical photographs, and various other images culminating in actual stills from the film's production. So ultimately, I think this is an essential book for any Western fans, any John Ford fans. If you love The Searchers and you haven't read this book yet, you really need to, and it belongs on your bookshelf as a great reference work, as you'll be able to return to it time and time again. There's no better source to go and look at in terms of not just The Searchers as a film, but just the whole world of the legends that grew into both novel and film. And with each section representing each of the sort of eras of this development of this legend, you essentially have a well-researched great piece in each act about each section of the legend that developed. So it's got essentially inside of it a great work of historical research about the real life stories, and then of course the legends that developed. Then it's got a great section about the gestation and development and publication of the novel, drawing from the real events and legends. And then it's got the great section about the making of and release of the film itself. So reading this, it's all building up to the actual film's production as that sort of center point of cementing the legend for all time. But it is just, again, it's a fantastic book to just dive into, and it's one that you just get completely immersed in. So even though it is mostly devoted to the first two acts, talking about the real life people and events that led to the formation of the various legends, all of this is instructive and leading to the actual development of the film. And I think anybody who knows the film will be able to pick up on this and understand where the book is going and feel that approaching, so element after element adds up to get us to the actual start of the shooting and then the release in 1956. So I think this is a must-read if you're a fan of the film and you haven't read it already. It's a fantastic book. I wish there were more books like this that took this particular approach of basically taking us back all the way to the very start, or the historical events that led to the creation of story elements that eventually resulted in a great book or a classic film. And here we get all of that, starting from one central historical event, running all the way through to the development of legends around these people, and then leading to the novel, and then the film, and then the aftermath. So I think this is a truly great film book for anyone who loves The Searchers. any fan of Westerns, anyone who liked Frankel's other books. And again, I would highly recommend his book on High Noon as well if you haven't read that. I really enjoyed reading this, so I wanted to put something together in video form and talk about it a little bit because I don't think it's been quite talked about enough. So I definitely felt I had to read this after revisiting The Searchers and just sort of getting lost in the world of the story and its themes all over again. This is a perfect book to pick up every time you return to the classic film and you finish and you're sort of reeling afterwards with the sheer impact of the film. Then you can dive into Glenn Frankel's excellent book and experience the whole development of the story that became An American Legend. So as always, I hope my babblings about the world of classic films, film books, and printed materials has been at least somewhat fun and informative. Again, if you're at all interested, I would highly recommend reading this book. It is, I think, essential if you love the film or you're a big John Ford fan. So if you haven't read this, I can't recommend it highly enough. And it's just a really wonderfully constructed book that will hold your attention and immerse you in this story from page one. So going through the historical sections all the way up to the actual development and then the shooting and release of the iconic Searchers film. So as always, please do keep supporting your local independent bookstores by hopefully being able to pick up a copy of the excellent Making of an American Legend. Keep reading print books, and as always, thank you ever so much for watching.